I'm Reverend Cooper from Community Presbyterian Church, and I'm bringing you another book discussion on Dr. Winter's Mudhouse Sabbath. Today we're covering chapters 6 and 7. 6 begins with a discussion of body, and Lauren begins her chapter by talking about her experience skirt shopping and how her body image is built more on cultural concepts than on Christian or religious concepts. And she argues that our views of our bodies is a non-neutral issue, meaning that it is positively or negatively charged, and we've got to kind of pick a side. And if we're picking the more negatively charged concepts that culture feeds us, then we aren't able to embrace the more positively charged concepts that religion teaches and has available to those who might be interested in taking them up. And so this chapter is particularly interesting because she lays out the way in which the Jewish culture has embraced those concepts of body image that are positive, and then starts to explain how in Christianity that framework is already set up. It just hasn't been embraced or promoted by the church for quite some time. So some of the things that are remarkable in Jewish practice are the bris. Certainly circumcision is a way in which bodies are marking the covenant between God and God's people. And so that's one way in which bodies are not just participating in religion, but they become partners in our religious experience. A full partnership with the body, mind and spirit, allows for a full expression of faith. And that's part of her argument too, is that the body is not disenfranchised in Judaism. It is an equal partner, if you will. Whereas in Christianity, the division between flesh and spirit can unfortunately disenfranchise the body. It's not an equal partner, it's a lesser partner. And so through her discussion of the bris, sexuality, and food, she gives some examples of the way that Jewish religion and culture embraces a positive body image and effectively requires the body's presence in a faithful relationship with God. And then she lifts up this, which I think is lovely, the Asher Yadzar, the blessing Jews recite after going to the bathroom, and uses that to foray into the doctrine of creation, explaining that part of the reason that the Jewish embrace of the body is so positive is that the basis is theologically and biblically sound. It's based on an acknowledgement that God said all creation was good. And so there is sort of a metaphysical or ontological way of viewing ourselves in the world as created by God in a way that allows us to participate in the goodness of creation. It was written from the beginning of time that our bodies were intended as a positive part of God's creation. And so she distinguishes that slightly from a metaphysical or ontological concept of body, self, and the world in creation, by quoting Daniel Boyarin, who says that for rabbinic Jews, the human being was defined as a body, animated, to be sure, by a soul. Whereas for Christians, the essence of a human being is a soul housed in a body. And so this sort of gets at what I was saying earlier about an unequal partnership between spirit, mind, and body, in that in Judaism, not just as promulgated by the biblical accounts of creation in the book of Genesis, but also in the Hebraic understanding of the body, there's a better definition of how the body participates in our very existence. And it's that it is an equal partner of our being. Our bodies are equal partners with our souls. And then that is to be contrasted with the unequal partnership in Christianity, where a human being is a soul housed in a body, which gives a superior elevated position to the soul and a baser position to the body. This is certainly part of a Pauline understanding of our existence, of our metaphysical position, in that the spirit is always superior to the flesh. And you see that in the epistles and in and out of the New Testament. And then Dr. Winner talks about how that was eventually understood to have been Gnostic in thinking, and that was deemed to be heretical. So that separation of spirit from body, or the immaterial from material, was deemed by Christian forefathers to have been heretical ways of thinking in favor of a rightly ordered understanding of bodily desires for sex, food, and even sleep, as she writes on page 74. Be that though it may, it still didn't quite take root, because today, in our contemporary society, particularly in Christian churches, there seems to be a more Pauline concept, maybe even more of a Gnostic concept, wherein there is disdain for the body, there is frustration with material matters, and I think that there's sort of a war between mind and body, between spirit and flesh, and it's often promulgated by preachers and Christians that one is superior to another and ought to be sought out. And so Dr. Winner contrasts that with a robust theology of the Christian body, by citing not only that our creation story is shared with the Jews and their basis of the creation story in Genesis. So the same biblical rationale that Jews have for celebrating the body is the same rationale that we have for celebrating the body, but she takes it a step further in talking about Jesus. She talks about how the bodily incarnation and the resurrection of the body, which happens in bodily form, as noted over and over again in the Bible, that we have even more reason to be attuned to the equal partner that is our body. And so she's sort of begging for a reconsideration reconsideration of that inequality between mind and body, or flesh and spirit. And then as she's offering us a theologically sound way to view our bodies from creation to Christ, she offers some helpful thoughts about how to live that out. She first states an intention, which is quite helpful. She says that really she wants to pay more attention to, on page 75, to my body and the things it does every day, and the connections between the work of my body and the daily service of God. So she's not just housing the spirit in the body, she's asking the question, how does my body participate spiritually in my existence that is and probably ought to be geared towards God? Then she gives us a variety of examples when she talks about breaking bread and doing so not just physically but spiritually. She gives the fun example shared by Stephanie Paulsell about an evening bath as a remembrance of baptism, and then even talks about exercise as a way to honor her creation. And then she forays into the more complicated area of bodily pain, and relates that then to the way in which in Christ's incarnate being, death, and resurrection, there was a bodily fate that involved suffering. And so she touches on all kinds of issues with the body, the Bible, and Christian theology. And personally, in reading this chapter, I found that this is probably one of her best developed chapters. She offers the prescriptive ideal, which she gives on, I believe it's 75, where she talks about what the ideal way of being a body in a Christian manner could be, in saying that it's paying attention to the connections between the work of my body and the daily service of God. And so she sets a prescriptive ideal sort of up here, and then she gives us all of these examples: the food, the bath time, the exercise, even in times of suffering and bodily pain and ill health, all of that, how we can engage that from a conceptual way to positively view our bodies as Christians. And so it's an ideal with applications that are varied. And I think that's a really healthy way to prescribe a practice or a spiritual discipline, because you're giving a concept and citing multiple possibilities for its application so that it could be taken up by really anyone and everyone. And it gives room for preferences and personal needs. You know, if you can't take baths but you love to exercise, then you have an example that's ready-made for you. Now, part of the reason I think this is one of her more successful chapters is because she's talking about a concept more so than a distinct practice. When she's talked about Shabbat or keeping kosher or prayer, for example, those are already practices that come with a specific set of limitations. And while they are also concepts, the idea of being a body is, yes, a practice and a concept, but it's more theoretical. And so I think that she has more room to be successful here in sharing prescriptions and doing so from a successful, yet again, conceptual base, because she's not confined to to the limits of an already set practice. So her way of thinking innovatively about a spiritual practice can be overlaid onto other practices that we take up routinely that are just part of hygiene, part of everyday life, things for that example that we can then spiritualize. And so I think that she's just got a more open-ended platform in talking about body as opposed to a previously set practice. And then the last thing I'll say is that she does a really good job in this chapter of ironing out the theological issues that would underlie any such concept. First of all, she does so by bringing up the theology of incarnation. So there's a ready-made, astutely applied theological concept in Christianity that works with her concept. And she's working against the Pauline concepts that denigrate the body and Gnostic concepts that denigrate the body. And so she's pulling on incarnational theology, Christology, and then she's also pulling on creation. So it's biblical, it's theological, and she's got some great points there. And the last thing I'll say about that is that she's also doing an excellent job in this chapter of framing the Christian possibilities here as not only having grand potential, but as being somehow equal to Judaic customs that are already in place. And so in some of her former chapters, one of the sort of issues, if you will, that I personally have in reading it, just from a rhetorical perspective, is that there's a superiority issue being played out, where Jews do it better, here's where you need to catch up. And there's an equal footing to be had by Jewish folks and Christians. And so I think that she can capture a Christian audience with a bit more attention, not being as critical, but being more open-minded. Dr. Winter's 7th chapter is on fasting, and here she starts by talking about the way that her priest encouraged her to take up the practice and how she resisted it for some time. She dives then into the fact that in Judaism, fasting is a given, and she cites more examples of how that plays out in Jewish culture and custom. And she shares some funny experiences about her accidentally breaking fast because of how hungry she was in college. She then relates that to the longstanding history of fasting in Christianity, and begins with Jesus fast in the Bible for 40 days, then talks about how it became a central discipline in church history for quite some time through the Middle Ages, and how people fell away from it after the Reformation, and that it's typically associated with Lenten fasts, where people give up one item, and she's calling those mini fasts for the entire period of Lent. She does bring up the Catholic connotation that is associated more with fasting for Christians than it is for Protestants, but notes clearly that the Second Vatican Council stripped fasting of its obligatory status, which is pretty interesting, saying that it's no longer an obligation during Lent and on. And she talks about Orthodox Christian communities, evangelical communities, and just is discussing denominational variations on the discipline. And then she talks about what her experience was like when she decided to cave to her priest and take up the practice again. And that's where she starts to get at what she would identify as the heart of the discipline. And she quotes Thomas Aquinas saying that fasting is to be a perfect quieting of all our impulses, fleshly and spiritual. And then she shares her own finding, which is, I think, the most compelling piece of this chapter, where she says that in fasting she found that she's hungriest for God, and her truest hunger is for God. And so in response to what she's putting forth in this chapter, it's interesting to see how, again, part of what she's doing here is not pitting Jewish practices against Christian practices. She's really drawing a bridge between the two and creating some common ground. She says this is something that is done in Jewish culture and has been done in Christian culture. And what's at the heart of this that might be beneficial for us? And so, much like she did in the chapter about body, she's not pitting one against the other as superior. And I think that's helpful in terms of capturing attention. Yet again, much like it was successful in doing so in the chapter on body. And, you know, much of what she's sharing here, it's a really short chapter, so it's pretty quick. A lot of what she's sharing is sort of recycled material, stuff we've heard before. We fast because it quiets the impulses and focuses our attention on God. Yes, we're hungry, but that's not the point. What I think she uncovers or reveals in this chapter that is new, at least for me, and therefore became her most compelling argument, was the way in which, in her own experience of fasting as a Christian woman, she discovered that her truest hunger was for God. And quickly, in the very last sentences of this chapter, she talks about how that then drew her to see her dependence on God, recognizing that when she was well fed in body, it was easier for her to feel independent from God. And so I think she's playing with something really profound here and suggesting that the practice is less about the abstention from food, which is often, you know, what practices are about, is the prescription of action. How do we do this kind of thing? And in her entire book, she's trying to get at not just how do we do this, but why do we do this? And here she just gives such a clearly distilled argument for why this would be incredibly beneficial, is that this practice is a physical and spiritual reminder of our dependence on God. The two are not uncoupled. They come part and parcel of one another. You can't fast without recognizing that your spirit and your body are dependent on our Creator God. And again, that just for me was a new way of framing the idea of fasting. I've certainly heard what Thomas Aquinas has said, that, you know, the idea is to exercise discipline or to control impulses so as to help us better discipline our bodies, reminding our spirits of what we need to abstain from behaviorally in this world in order to be more successful spiritually. It's sort of in that sense, it unfortunately sort of becomes a punishment period where, you know, you abstain from food as a reminder that there are other abstentions you must make in your everyday life if you want to be fulfilled. And so she's sort of putting that on its head in a different way and saying that fulfillment doesn't come from the abstention. She's saying that the abstention allows us to see more fully how we are always fulfilled. And so maybe not fully on its head, but she's just sort of nudging at this idea of why we do it and pushing back and saying that, it's less about the discipline and more, and discipline of self at that, but more about the relationship between ourselves and God. And I think that is inherently far more appealing to Christians because the basis of our faith is relational. And so being drawn into a spiritual practice that's strictly about abstention and discipline is probably not going to be the most appealing. But seeing it differently as an opportunity to grow with God by recognizing that on non-fast days, there is food readily available to you, food that is born of this earth, God-given bounty to us to sustain us. And on days when we do fast, we are reminded that all of that comes from God, but we also come from God. Our spirits come from God. Our bodies come from God. And all of the God's creation that sustains us is a part of a greater system, and we are dependent on that system. We are not independent of it. And so it's just painting a wholly different picture for me. I hope I've clearly laid out how that very little tidbit at the end of her chapter helped to reshape my thinking about the practice. And hopefully she's written some things and shared some things in this chapter that helped you to rethink the practice. But that's all I have to share for this week. Next week, we'll be doing chapters 8 and 9, and I look forward to discussing with you further. Eastertide blessings to you and yours.